The attack on Varney's 9. Alec Drake had only just stepped off the transport ship when the ground beneath him quaked. He had barely processed the sterile air of Varney's 9, the medical research hub that had promised peace and cooperation, when the alarm bells rang. His boots had barely hit the tarmac when all hell broke loose. The sudden flash of green energy lit up the gray sky, followed by a high-pitched whine as plasma blasts arced overhead. One of them hit the transport ship, sending it careening off the landing pad in a fireball. The crowd scattered, but Alec stood rooted, scanning the horizon. The unmistakable shapes of armed fighters, humanoid but far from human, emerged from the jungle surrounding the landing zone. "Damn it," Alec muttered, his pulse quickening. So much for diplomacy. Without hesitation, he drew his sidearm. The standard-issue M42, bulky and old by some standards, was still better than nothing. Alec fired off a few rounds into the advancing enemies, the sound of impact echoing in his ears. They didn't flinch. Their smooth, almost featureless gray skin absorbed the rounds, as if they were little more than annoying insect bites. Shit. Armor. Alec cursed under his breath. These were no ordinary raiders, they were armed to the teeth with tech far beyond his level. A sharp pain shot through his leg as one of the enemy's plasma rounds found its mark. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to remain standing as his vision blurred with the intensity of the injury. The wound wasn't deep, but the heat from the blast had seared the muscle. He felt his body betray him, but he didn't give in. Not now. A flicker of motion caught his eye. His squad, scattered among the crowd, were trying to fight back, but it was futile. More enemies were closing in. With his mind in overdrive, Alec fired a few more rounds and sprinted toward the nearest building, dragging his wounded leg behind him. The air was thick with smoke and panic, and he could hear the cries of civilians in the distance, but he couldn't afford to look back. His team was scattered, the enemy was closing in, and all he could do was keep moving. He ducked into the safety of a medical complex, only to be greeted by a barrage of blinding lights from above. A crash of glass. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed across the hall. He didn't have time to think. His breath was ragged, and his vision swam. Just a few more meters, he told himself. Alec stumbled into the medical bay, collapsing onto a gurney. The lights flickered as several humanoid figures, green-skinned and equipped with advanced medical apparatus, rushed toward him. He barely registered their presence as they began removing his armor and assessing the damage to his leg. "Human," one of the medics said, his voice calm but mechanical. "You are gravely injured. This is a triage situation. Do not resist." Alec's head was swimming from the blood loss, but he couldn't ignore the chilling undertone in the medic's voice. The tone was detached, scientific, even. These weren't the empathetic, friendly faces of medics he was used to back home. The beings that surrounded him now were cold, efficient, and utterly unemotional. "Do I look like I'm resisting?" Alec spat, struggling to focus his blurry vision. "Just, get it over with." His words were clipped, a grimace contorting his face. The pain in his leg felt like it was going to consume him whole, but he didn't care. He had been through worse. He had lived through worse. The alien medic didn't flinch at Alec's tone, continuing his work as if Alec were an experiment. He inserted a glowing needle into Alec's arm. "This will help stabilize your condition." "Don't bother," Alec grunted, his voice low but defiant. "I've had worse." The medic didn't respond, though his hands moved with surgical precision. Alec's heart rate spiked as he felt the cool rush of a strange fluid entering his veins. The room's lights flickered again, a low hum filling the air. Another figure entered, a tall, angular being with elongated features and a cold, calculating gaze. Alec immediately recognized the insignia on his uniform, Dr. Zavroth. The new figure's gaze lingered on Alec for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "Human," Zavroth began, his voice silky and unnervingly smooth. "You are incredibly fortunate that our medical technologies are capable of saving your life. Such injuries would have killed a lesser being." Alec raised an eyebrow, despite the dizziness overtaking him. You're not saving my life. You're trying to figure out how the hell I'm still alive, aren't you? Zavroth's lips twitched, whether it was a smile or just a quirk of his alien anatomy, Alec couldn't tell. Your survival is notable. Remarkable, even. Alec scoffed, his breath shallow as he gripped the edge of the gurney. I've had my share of scrapes. You know, back on Earth, we don't have the luxury of playing around with fancy tech. When we get hit, we deal with it. Zavroth seemed unfazed by Alec's defiant tone. Fascinating. Such a primitive approach to life. You see, on Varney's 9, our medical techniques transcend your concept of dealing. You will be healed in a matter of minutes, and your body will be restored, provided you cooperate. Alec bit back a laugh. Cooperate? You're poking me with all kinds of shit and calling it cooperation? The alien medic hovering above him didn't speak, but Zavroth didn't seem to mind. Instead, his gaze never left Alec. Fascinating indeed. A human in such a state of trauma, yet not only are you conscious, but your recovery rate is far beyond what we've ever encountered. Alec's eyes narrowed. He didn't like the sound of that. What do you mean recovery rate? What are you trying to do here? Zavroth's cold voice answered with a calm finality. You are the perfect subject for an experiment. To understand the limits of human biology, to see how far you can endure and survive. Alec's heart pounded, not from pain but from realization. This wasn't just about saving his life. They were studying him. He wasn't a patient to them, he was a puzzle, a thing to be dissected, analyzed. Alec met Zavroth's calculating gaze with his own. Well, Doc, you're in for a long wait. I don't break that easily. With that, he let his eyes close. He wasn't going to make this easy for them, but he knew one thing, he'd survive. He always did. Alec awoke to a strange sensation, a cold, invasive hum vibrating through his chest. The sterile scent of the medical bay was thick in the air, and his body felt lighter, almost weightless. For a brief moment, he thought he had died. But the pain in his leg, a dull throb now, rather than the searing agony from before, reminded him he was still very much alive. He shifted on the gurney, his limbs stiff but functional, and immediately noticed the lack of sensation in his arm. They'd treated it. The hole left by the plasma blast was gone, replaced by a faint scar-like mark, barely visible. You're awake. The voice was cold, smooth, and familiar. Alec didn't need to look to know it was Zavroth. His presence loomed like a shadow, calculating and predatory. Alec cracked open his eyes. Zavroth stood at the foot of the gurney, his arms folded behind his back. The doctor was more composed than ever, his white lab coat gleaming in the soft blue light of the medical bay. Alec could feel Zavroth's gaze, sharp and unblinking, studying him. I trust you are feeling better? Zavroth asked, though it wasn't really a question. It was an observation. A conclusion he had already drawn, based on his alien understanding of the human body. Alec sat up slowly, testing his body. His leg, while still sore, felt surprisingly intact. He moved his arm, no pain. Just a slight tightness around the surgical site. It was unnerving how quickly they'd patched him up. They'd almost overdone it. He hadn't asked for this. But here he was. Better? Alec repeated, his voice thick with sarcasm. I guess you could say that. Just missing a few pieces. Your recovery is impressive, Zavroth observed, his voice devoid of warmth. I've never seen a human exhibit this level of resilience. And your ability to endure such trauma, unheard of in our studies. Alec narrowed his eyes. Studies? You mean experiments? Zavroth didn't react, his face a mask of calm. You misunderstand. You are an anomaly, Captain Drake. An extraordinary specimen. I'm simply attempting to understand the limits of your physiology. Alec snorted, his brow furrowing. Right. Well, if you're so fascinated by the human body, maybe you should have stuck to research. I wasn't exactly part of your plan. I disagree, Zavroth countered smoothly, tilting his head as he approached the gurney. Your survival isn't just a matter of your physical form. It's a testament to your species' tenacity. Resilience. Alec's gaze hardened. Yeah, that's what you think, isn't it? You see us as some kind of test subject. Some sort of experiment. You don't get it. Humans aren't just data points on a chart. Zavroth's lips twitched, the faintest hint of something almost resembling a smile. Humanity's emotional complexities are what interest me most. You are driven by something, beyond logic. Something irrational, even. Yet you survive against the odds. Alec clenched his jaw. You can't dissect that. You can't measure it with your fancy machines or study it under your microscope. It's not something you can understand. The alien doctor's eyes glimmered with an unreadable expression. Perhaps. But I intend to try. Alec had enough. The man, or whatever he was, had been circling around him for hours, making quiet observations, but never truly interacting. Alec was no lab rat. He'd fought his way through hell, and he wouldn't let some cold-blooded alien treat him like one. How much longer are you going to keep me here? Alec growled, pulling himself off the gurney, his feet hitting the floor with a soft thud. I'm fine. I don't need your tests. I didn't sign up for this. I was here for a damn peace mission. Zavroth watched him, unmoved, before responding. You misunderstand, Captain. Your species, your body, your will to survive, it interests us. And I would be remiss if I didn't learn from you. Alec's eyes flashed. Oh, I'm sure you would. But that doesn't mean I'm going to be your guinea pig. Let me walk out of here, or I'll find my own way. Zavroth didn't flinch, his gaze never leaving Alec's face. I believe you are mistaken. Your physical well-being is still precarious. You sustain injuries far beyond what we typically see in human anatomy. You will not be walking anywhere until I am certain you will not succumb to further trauma. Alec's patience snapped. You think I'm fragile? That I'm some. Before he could finish, the alien's voice cut through him like a razor. You misunderstand. Your species' stubbornness is remarkable. But it will only take you so far. Alec bit back the impulse to lash out. He didn't have time for this. The attack on the settlement had been an ambush, not an isolated incident. He needed to find out who was behind it. More importantly, he needed to get out of here before the aliens turned his body into some sort of research project. But as he stood there, stiff-legged, facing Zavroth's emotionless stare, something gnawed at him. The doctor's obsession with him was more than just scientific curiosity. It was something deeper. Something personal. Alec could see it in his eyes. He was a test. A puzzle to be solved. And for the first time in years, Alec wondered if he was losing control of his own body. Zavroth, sensing the tension, offered a calculated smile. Perhaps you think I've been too forward in my approach. I'll allow you some time to adjust. Adjust? Alec spat, leaning back against the cold metal of the wall. Yeah, right. Let me adjust to being a specimen in your little laboratory. You are not a specimen, Zavroth corrected, his voice soft but firm. You are an opportunity. For both our species. You have no idea what we could accomplish together. Alec's eyes narrowed. What makes you think I want anything to do with you people? Zavroth's face remained impassive. Because your survival instinct will drive you to cooperate. Even if you don't understand why. Alec didn't reply. He simply stood there, his mind racing. The more Zavroth spoke, the more Alec realized that the alien doctor wasn't just interested in understanding humanity's physical capabilities. He wanted to control it. He'd seen it before, back on Earth. People who believed they could improve others for their own purposes. But Alec wasn't a lab rat. He wouldn't be anyone's experiment. I've got nothing to prove to you, Zavroth, Alec said finally, his voice low and steady. You want to understand us? Fine. But you're not going to break us. Not this human. Zavroth said nothing. Instead, he studied Alec, his gaze lingering for a moment longer before he finally nodded. Very well. But remember, Captain Drake, you are a fascinating subject. And I will not stop until I understand how you tick. With that, the alien doctor turned on his heel, leaving Alec to grapple with the nagging feeling that he wasn't just in a medical facility. He was in the heart of something much darker. Alec clenched his fists, the weight of his words settling like lead in his stomach. He would survive. He always did. But the question now was, at what cost? The unseen enemy. Alec spent the next few days locked in the sterile confines of the medical bay, though locked wasn't quite the right term. His movements were unrestricted, he could leave the room, roam the corridors if he wished. But every step felt like an invisible leash was wrapped around his neck, tightening with each passing hour. The alien medics were everywhere, watching him. Their eyes, so clinical and precise, gave nothing away. He tried to gather information, ask questions, dig around, anything, but it was clear that the Varney's 9 medical team wasn't going to let him slip through their fingers so easily. Captain Drake, Zavroth's voice interrupted his thoughts one morning as he sat on the edge of the bed, his legs dangling over the side. He didn't look up at first, not until he heard the distinct hiss of the medical bay door opening. The doctor was here again. Alec had come to realize that his presence wasn't random. It was intentional, methodical. Zavroth was watching him, studying him. But for what purpose? What now, Zavroth? Alec said without turning to face him, his voice tight. He didn't need to act like a prisoner. Not yet. Zavroth stepped closer, his figure looming as ever. I have new information. About the attack on the settlement. Alec's heart skipped a beat. He stood up sharply, facing the alien, his earlier irritation giving way to raw urgency. You know who did it? I have a theory, Zavroth said, his tone as measured as always. Our initial scans suggested the attackers were from an unknown faction. But recent reports suggest this wasn't a simple raid. It appears there's a greater force behind it. One that is interested in your species. Alec's fists clenched. And what's that supposed to mean? Zavroth tilted his head, the angular lines of his face betraying nothing. The attackers, they didn't just want supplies. They weren't here for resources. They were after you. Alec swallowed, his pulse quickening. The thought that he was the target sent a chill through him. Me? Why? Zavroth's eyes gleamed with something like fascination, though Alec wasn't sure he trusted it. I believe your unique survival capabilities are of significant interest to them. Whatever this faction is, they have taken note of your resilience. Resilience? Is that what you're calling it now? Alec scoffed. I'm just a soldier. I've been through worse and survived. Zavroth's voice remained calm. Not like this. What you experienced was beyond the normal scope of human endurance. Your body should have failed, but it didn't. Alec's gaze narrowed. You think my body's some kind of experiment? The alien nodded slowly. I'm certain of it. And the attackers want to understand how your species, can withstand the kind of damage they deal out. I suspect they're after you for something more than just your life. So, they're going to use me as some kind of test subject too? Alec said, his voice growing cold with anger. Not happening. Zavroth's eyes flicked toward the door, as though gauging whether they were alone. They won't need to. You will be their tool, Captain Drake. The words hit Alec like a punch to the gut. A tool. He thought about the experiments Zavroth had mentioned before, the way they'd treated him. But this was different. A tool, that was something else entirely. The thought sent a surge of adrenaline through him, and his mind raced. What kind of enemies was he facing? What were they willing to do to him, and to the rest of humanity? Why are you telling me this? Alec demanded, his voice hardening. If you think I'm some kind of freak show to be studied, why even bother with the warning? Zavroth's gaze flickered. Because you are not the only one at risk. They are targeting all humans. And if they succeed with you, others will follow. Your species may never recover. Alec's stomach twisted with a mixture of dread and determination. He had a feeling that Zavroth was telling the truth, in his own alien way. The threat was bigger than anything he had imagined. Whatever this faction was, they were not going to stop until they had the answers they were looking for. And if they could exploit humanity's unique ability to endure, it would mean the end of freedom. The end of everything. So, what now? Alec asked, his voice flat, masking the turmoil inside. I will need to continue monitoring your recovery, Zavroth replied coolly. There are tests to be run. Your physiology, your body, it's the key to understanding how we can prepare for this new threat. Alec clenched his fists, fighting the urge to snap. I'm not your guinea pig, Zavroth. I didn't sign up for any of this. The alien doctor stepped closer, his voice dropping lower, almost conspiratorially. It is not about what you signed up for, Captain. It is about survival. The question is, will you cooperate, or will you stand in the way of your own species' future? The words hung in the air like a silent threat, a promise wrapped in a veneer of concern. Alec knew what it meant. Cooperation meant submission. But fighting meant he was walking straight into a war he wasn't prepared for. Zavroth's gaze softened just slightly. You're right to resist. That is what makes you human. But know this, Captain, the price of your refusal is steep. Alec took a step back, his mind working at full speed. There was too much at stake here. He couldn't afford to be reckless. He needed to think. He needed a way out. The more Zavroth spoke, the clearer it became, this wasn't just a medical mission gone wrong. This was bigger. Much bigger. Tell me, Alec said, his voice hard, eyes locked on the aliens. What are you going to do if I don't cooperate? Zavroth's lips curved into the faintest smile, but there was no humor in it. I will give you one more chance, Captain. But know that your species' survival depends on your compliance. We have much to learn from you. Alec didn't respond. He simply turned his back on the alien doctor, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Zavroth's words echoed in his mind. Survival, that was what this was really about. Not just his survival, but the survival of humanity itself. And suddenly, Alec understood. This wasn't just a fight for his life. This was the first shot in a war for the future of his entire species. As Zavroth left, Alec stood there in the cold, sterile silence of the medical bay, trying to piece together the fragments of what he'd just learned. One thing was certain now, the war was coming. And Alec wasn't just going to survive. He was going to fight.